Hi everyone and welcome. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Isa Hassan. Thanks a lot for traveling all the way from Cambridge today. So Dr. Isa Hassan is an associate professor at the University of Cambridge. She's also the Mohamed Noha Fellow at Pembroke College. Dr. Hassan's research sits at the intersection of law, society, religion, and politics. Her work is very interdisciplinary as she mobilizes historical approaches, but also the analysis of institutional processes. And of course, she also examines the emergence and the genealogies of specific forms of law. So, through her interdisciplinary angle, she has widely studied Islam and Muslim politics. In her book, titled The Politics of Islamic Law, Local Elites, Colonial Authority, and the Making of the Muslim State, she explores the historical construction of what we now know as the category of Islamic law in colonial India, Malaya, and Egypt. The book combines a genealogy of law with a political analysis of its institutional dynamics and transformations. It shows essentially that the foundations of what we now know as Islamic law were built during the colonial encounter in these three contexts in which she's conducting her research. Currently, she has moved on to new and exciting projects. She is writing a book manuscript on the travels of law across the Indian Ocean region. She is also involved in a number of collaborative projects. For instance, she's working on collaborative projects in the internet fatwa and on other projects on challenges to liberal governance in Southeast Asia. She has published a huge number of articles in these different areas. I will not list them here, but her scholarship has been prolific to date. Dr. Hassan is also the editor of the Cambridge University Press series, Asian Connections, and she also sits on the editorial boards of a number of prominent journals in her field of research. So we're very happy to welcome you today, and we are looking forward to your talk. So I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Professor Lito Monet and the department for the invitation. This talk is based on the book that Annabelle just mentioned, coming out, well, whenever Cambridge University Press decides to turn on the press. So it's going into production, hopefully after review this summer. And the book is entitled All the Seas Were Ink, Itineraries of Islam, Law and Sovereignty. Because this is a talk based on a book, at each of the venues I've been speaking about it, I've had the opportunity to present pieces to colleagues in multiple fields across disciplines and locations. And so over the last year in New Zealand at the University of Otago to law and religion scholars, I focused on law and language in circulation. At the University of Sydney to anthropologists of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the focus was on material and textual translations. And at Yale Law School at the Carmel Center for Islamic Law, it was on Islamic and comparative constitutionalism. I say this because I'm happy in the questions or in conversation to speak about all of those things, but here, in a city uniquely positioned to observe the international as a social, institutional, cultural, and economic field capable of and requiring constant reinvention, I wanted to address the history of the international and the history of Islamic constitutionalism from a place where global histories of law and Islam do not generally begin. So while on the trail of documents for the book that became The Politics of Islamic Law, I searched for the text of the Constitution of Johore, dated 1895, Johore is now in the Federation of Malaysia. It is directly to the north of Singapore. Every reference I had seen to this constitution referred to it as Undang-Undang Tubuh Kerajaan Johor and translated that as the Constitution of the State of Johor in English. So I thought I was looking for a physical text, one original document produced shortly before or after 1895. I found 4. And amidst these 4, I saw references to Johor having adopted the Ottoman Majalla, translated again into English as the Civil Code of the Ottoman Empire in 1892. I thought to myself, if the state of Johor could produce 4 versions of its constitution, a document firmly in the tradition of codified state and textual law, how many versions of the Majalla would I find? I found none. I'll return to these multiple and fugitive texts in the second half of my talk, which discusses translation. First, though, having failed to find a single point of arrival, an originary text of the Majalla in Johor, I sought to trace the pathways by which these texts might have travelled to Johor. Seeking one text, a constitution, which I had assumed at the start to be a Western arrival, I found a prior text, an Ottoman import. Prior to the texts of 1895 and 1892, I found journeys. Cairo, Constantinople, Tokyo, not just in 1892, but in visits by Johor rulers and elites going back to the 1850s and 60s. The traces of these journeys made it difficult to accept the idea of a Johor constitution whose origin could credibly be British lawyers making a draft in 1895. So moments of arrival were quickly becoming journeys and circulations, repeated and retraced for at least 3 decades prior to the moment of constitutional promulgation, covering not only the Tanzimat Constitution of the Ottomans in 1876, but the Meiji Constitution in Japan of 1890, both of which had multiple and complex antecedents of their own. And going back to the 1850s and 60s in search of Ottomans in the legal life of Johor, I found Malay, Danish, Chinese, and Circassian royal marriages to women who played important economic, dynastic, and political roles in Johor. I found Hadrami and Meccan ulama and advisors, British lawyers, Chinese business partners, multiple and repeated visits from British, Hawaiian, and US delegations. And I found Abu Bakar, ruler of Johor. These are all photographs and portraits of Abu Bakar, going from your left to your right across his lifetime. So the earliest portrait is from 1862. The last one is not the final one, but that one is dated 1885, and I'll talk about them later. So this is ruler of Johor. He was born in 1833 and died in 1896, and he himself spent a significant duration of his reign outside his realm. In the Malay States, in Singapore, in Java, in the United Kingdom, Turkey, British India, Japan, Prussia, Cairo, and Constantinople. And it is around him that this story began to coalesce. The book, which has emerged from this initial archival puzzle, begins to tell a history of Islam, constitutions, and the making of what we now call the international from this vantage point. The book ends with the Constitution of Johor, Undang-Undang Tubuh Kerajaan Johor in Malay, promulgated in 1895. The Constitution of the State of Johor is noteworthy for at least 2 reasons. It was the first constitution in Southeast Asia, and it was one of the earliest constitutions in the world to explicitly declare Islam the religion of the state, a moment largely forgotten in histories of modern Islamic constitutionalism. Johor's adoption of a constitution came after the constitutions of Tunisia in 1861 and the Ottomans in 1876, but by the time of its adoption, neither of these laws were in force. In 1895, Johor was the only state in the world to have Islam as the religion of the state in its constitution, and its interpretation of the role and place of Islam differed significantly from its precedents. This constitutional formulation was then taken on by other Malay states, passed into the Federal Constitution of Malaya, and into the present moment. Johor, therefore, represents the world's longest still-running experiment in Islamic constitutionalism, yet rarely receives mention in chronologies of Islam, in constitutions, except as part of the federation. So the history of how this came to be is a history of modern Muslim state-making, to be sure, but it is also a history of the making of international law and international hierarchies, told through the travels of a man who played a significant and now largely forgotten role in their formation. I approach the telling of this story from the perspective of Abu Bakar at sea. So you'll see these are early, not maps, they're navigational charts of the Straits of Johore, of the bodies of water between Malacca, Johore, and Singapore, even from the 1600s onwards, incredibly important waterways for international trade, for the making of international law, as we'll talk about later, but also famously treacherous, difficult, unnavigable waters. So these are charts, that admit to the unknownness of those waters in the 1830s to the 1890s, right? So there's passageways, such as the one just to the south of Singapore, where somebody has written imperfectly known. In the larger of the navigational charts, you'll see at the very top markers of how land masses through the Straits of Johore and the Straits of Malacca and Singapore would look from a boat at sea, rather than from the kinds of maps that we're used to now, which look as though from the eye of God, right? From above, all known, all navigable. Somewhere in that water, there are little notations that say things like "probably safe." It's my favorite. So this is a history not of interconnection, circulation, multi-location, and cosmopolitanism from the eye of God. It is a history from the perspective of navigators, travelers, rulers, elites, sailors, still at sea, still navigating according to landscapes that were unfolding as they moved. And improvisation through waters that were actively being charted, of maps being remade, of landmarks still coming into legibility. And those landmarks include the international, the Islamic law. These were experienced not as an institutional, established array whose contours were mapped and known, but made sense of, renegotiated through a panoply of encounters. In ships at sea, in port cities, in courtrooms, in world exhibitions, and in marriages across long distance. And so as a matter of method, the book traces itineraries of people, ideas, institutions, which then lead to law's manifold translations, which turn out then to also have trajectories of their own. This is a history of law in motion, and an exploration of methods for thinking about law in motion at the intersection of Islamic legal studies, the history of international law, and world history. More familiar maps. As experienced from Johore in the second half of the 19th century, Islamic and constitutional history ran not only through British and Ottoman imperial states, but through Aceh, Japan, and Germany, Tunisia and the United States, and other places as well. Steam and the newly reconfigured global trade routes running between the Straits of Johore, Constantinople, and London through the canal at Suez, newly built in 1869, brought the world to Johore and facilitated conversation with Javanese and Ottomans, Indians and Hawaiians, Siamese and Japanese, all of whom invested in a myriad of social, political, and cultural experiments in the face of imperial pressure. The political world in which Abu Bakar lived was navigated within and between regional, imperial, and international registers of sovereignty and power. So the phrase, "all the seas were ink," is a phrase that emerges from millennia of deep entanglement between sacred text and its human elaborations. In Jewish and Muslim traditions, the metaphor refers to the inexhaustibility of revelation, to wisdom without fathom. The trees of the earth were pens, the seas were ink. It's Quranic as well as Talmudic. Across the longest of its arc, this is one iteration of an ongoing struggle to express religion in the language of human institutions and history. At the moment of this story, the metaphor captures an episode in that struggle, in which the seas and the textual capture of revelation proved particularly consequential for the history of our present. More and more were taking to the sea in search of sovereignty and recognition, and when they caught sight of these horizons, they sought to capture them as law and as text. For Abu Bakar of Johore, who provides its narrative and archival spine, all the seas were ink, a lifetime of navigating archipelagic and imperial logics of authority, of chasing sovereignty at sea, of charting new spaces through traveling law and translating Islam. And these lead us to the rediscovery of alternative sites for the study of the making of the modern Muslim state, revealing histories of imperialism and international law, and forgotten genealogies of sovereignty, constitutionalism, and Asian internationalism. So the rest of this lecture returns to the Constitution and the Majalla with which I began at the end of the 1890s, in order to zoom in on two strands of argument in the book and the methods they entail. The first of these is that Johore's 19th century legal imaginary charts the contours of an inter-imperial international arena, within which interlocking vocabularies of sovereignty, authority, legitimate rule, religion, and race emerged. In the book, I call this the princely international. The second thread that runs through is that Islamic constitutionalism is a global genre of law in motion. That Islam shall be the religion of the state as a formula is a product of global circulations of law. So approaching the story of the Majalla and the Constitution from the vantage point of Abu Bakar at sea yields a reading of 19th century Muslim repertoires of law, elaborated by navigating the spaces between empires, in this particular case the Ottomans and the British, in the pursuit of recognition and sovereignty. And I'm about to take you through some of this material archive back to the photographs and the portraits of Abu Bakar as a mirror for talking about the work of translation and law. I use the material archive as a way to try and de-exceptionalize law and Islamic law as well in these repertoires of representation and sovereignty. Abu Bakar's career charted the progress of a ruler who went from strength to strength by positioning himself within regional and imperial registers of power as a broker and a facilitator. He was not born a sultan, he made himself one. He inherited rulership of the state as Temanggung of Johore upon the death of his father in 1862, and that's the first of the photographs, the one on the left, where you see him wearing clothing that represents Malay identities in evolution, but particularly Johore identities in evolution between Singapore and Malaysia in the 1860s into the 1870s. It's a fairly univocal representation. It's a representation that coincides with the advent of studio portrait photography. So the portrait itself was taken by J. Thompson and is in the Edinburgh, the Royal National Library of Scotland. And encapsulates a particular moment, a moment when Abu Bakar's father has just died, making him Temanggung of Johore, a kind of harbour master and noble elite, but not a sultan, right? Not an Islamic ruler per se, not even first among equals yet. This is a moment as well in which the Dutch and the English were navigating the Straits of Johore and Malacca, attempting to establish and extend the British strongholds of the Strait settlements. And Abu Bakar uses his experience and his indispensability to the British in Johore and Singapore to navigate between British India and the Malay world, where he makes himself space. In the 1860s and the 1870s, he goes to the Delhi Darbar. There's a very long hierarchy invested line of canon salutes and honorifics and medals and ceremonials. And he discovers in Delhi, at the court of British India, that he didn't rank and register in quite the way that he wished he would, right? So he brokers the language of British India and the language of British imperialism to negotiate a position for himself as Maharaja of Johore. This is not a Malay title, it's an Indian imperial one. And he gets made Maharaja of Johore in 1868, and that's the second of the portraits from the left. Between the British Indian Empire and the Ottoman, there is also a great deal of navigating to do, and you'll see in that second portrait the language of representation shifting, right? There's material that is being drawn, not just from Malay dress and the dress of the Straits world, but increasingly gestures in the direction of Aceh, gestures in the direction of the Ottoman Empire, the sword as well, right? Gestures to the increasingly sort of martial, military ceremonial portraiture of the British imperial world. If there are costume historians or people who like to talk about clothes in the room, I'm happy to go back and talk about them later. And so he leverages status, recognition, and semiotics between the British Indian Empire and the Ottoman, and begins increasingly to become legible in the language of the British Indian Empire and to the family of the Queen Empress Victoria of Britain and the United Kingdom. And that third photograph is taken immediately after a visit from Abu Bakar to Victoria and Albert at their private country estate in Scotland, Balmoral. He is wearing Scottish Highland dress that has been commissioned for him by the Queen. There is a Johore tartan. He's wearing the whole thing. Those of you who like Scottish dress, right, you'll see from all the way up, from his feet upwards, right? This is Highland dress at a moment when the British are reinventing Scotland as a place for expressing ethnicity, the exclusivity of culture, and their own indigeneity in the context of the United Kingdom. So intimacy, familial representation, friendship, within the language, the evolving language of global race representation and national imperial race representation as well. The British are not the only people that Abu Bakar spends time with. In 1883, so 2 years after the third portrait was taken, he visited Japan and was the first Asian ruler to be granted an audience with the Meiji Emperor after the reopening. When he visited Japan in 1883, he attended the state funeral of Chancellor Iwakura Tomomi, an instrumental figure in ongoing efforts to draft a Japanese constitution. That constitution and the short-lived Tanzimat constitution of the Ottomans in 1876 were the first in Asia and would be followed by the Johore constitution in 1885. In 1885, which is when this last portrait was taken by Alexander Bassano, he leveraged wealth, utility, and his closeness to Queen Victoria and the British Empire in Malaya to be recognized by treaty, first as Maharaja, then as Sultan of Johore. And again, you'll see, right, the language of representation evolving. There are medals from the Ottomans as well as the British. There are crescent and star representations on the cuffs, on the lapels, on the medals, on the headwear, and increasingly this sort of language of sovereignty expressed in part through the kind of semiotics of luxury, of authoritative kind of consumption, and of war, right? Increasingly martial clothing. And that language, we will see in a few minutes, reflects itself not just in the semiotics of representation, but also in the semiotics of constitutional writing. In an episode which will become important soon, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that in 1885 as well, sometime in the summer, somewhere along the River Thames outside of London, a woman named Jenny Mile was introduced to Abu Bakar, who told her his name was Albert Baker. By the time he left England, she believed that they would in time marry. He did return a number of times, but the promised marriage did not materialize. This will be significant in a few minutes. By the 1890s, developing his reputation as a sovereign monarch within an international context in the shadow of empire, Abu Bakr sends a pavilion to the World's Fair in Chicago. Again, representation, hierarchy, race, and commerce in an evolving and cooperative language of global modernity. This is what I call the ubiquitous language of the princely international. He is at home in Balmoral, at the World's Fair in Chicago, in Japan, and in London. His proximity to imperial and cosmopolitan culture both allows and requires him to navigate the racial, symbolic, and normative languages of modernity and sovereignty. And this will become important later in our story because it illustrates that the international imperial channels which the law would travel and unfold in were enmeshed with rising global narratives of race, of hierarchy, and of economy. As part of this package of reform, modernization, representation, and state-making, in 1892, Johore adopts the Ottoman Majalla, the Civil Code, a codification of the jurisprudence of the Hanafi school in matters of contract, torts, and civil procedure, and as part of a wider bureaucratic, legislative, and institutional reform. Abu Bakr's meetings and itineraries in the next few years in Egypt, in Constantinople, and other Ottoman cities suggest close contact with pan-Islamic, constitutionalist, and Islamic reformist networks. Remember Jenny Mile? 1893 is also the moment when Jenny Mile goes to the law herself. And she goes to the British courts and demands that Abu Bakr appears before the British courts for breach of promise. He refused to recognize their authority. So in 1893, there are two parallel stories developing, one of which is about British and international sovereignty, and the other one is about Ottoman and international sovereignty. Let's talk about the British for a moment. The British courts in 1893, at the moment that Jenny Mile makes her claim, looked at the Sultan of Johore, who had been known to Jenny Mile as Albert Baker, and turned for help to the Colonial Office. In 1893, there were as yet very few clear rules about what to do when a Maharaja, who was also an intimate of the Queen, dressed up as an Englishman, seduced an English woman under a pseudonym at the exact same time as he was negotiating a treaty with the Queen that would turn him into a sultan, and then denied the jurisdiction of British law because of that treaty. Abu Bakr's refusal pushed the British judges into generating answers to new questions in international law. Jenny Mile's lawyers identified the defendant as, in their suit, right, the Sultan of the State and Territory of Johore, otherwise known as Albert Baker. And they argued that Albert Baker, I quote, always represented himself and was treated by servants, tradesmen, and others as a private individual and a subject of the Queen. In 1885, as well as on subsequent trips back to England. The defendant's lawyers claimed that the courts of England had no jurisdiction over him as Sultan of Johore. So the judge, in this particular case, amongst a panel of them, adjourned a hearing of the motion in order to communicate with the Secretary of State for the colonies. And the Colonial Office responded to his question in 1893 in September. My lord, I am directed by the Marquis of Ripon to acquaint you that Johore is an independent state and territory in the Malay Peninsula, that His Highness Abu Bakr, Honorary GCM, Grand KCSI, is the President Sovereign Ruler thereof. It keeps going, right? It keeps going. I am to add that the Sultan has raised and maintains armed forces by sea and land, has organized a postal system, dispenses justice through regularly constituted courts of justice, has founded orders of knighthood, confers titles of honor, and generally speaking, exercises without question the usual attributes of a sovereign. Right? So you see being made extremely transparent at a moment when the judges themselves are not particularly sure how to recognize a sovereign in disguise, how the Colonial Office is teaching about the international. Based upon this letter, the decision was made, which nested the recognition of the sovereignty of Abu Bakr into the bureaucratic apparatus of the Colonial Office. and elaborated the content of his sovereignty. Abu Bakr was a sovereign because the colonial office recognized him as sovereign, through treaty and through a list of the usual attributes. Once determined a sovereign, the court considered possible exceptions to the rule of sovereign immunity that might have applied in this case, and found none. Cases of this kind in the 1880s served to translate the international law of the textbooks, and in this case, the judges relying on Vattel in particular, into the complexities of everyday transactions. Property owned by sovereigns, for which the case is Balmont Belge, overlaps between titles held by the same person, for which the case they cited was Duke of Brunswick versus the King of Hanover, relationships entered into under assumed identities, Mile versus the Sultan of Johore. 1893. Having refused the jurisdiction of the British courts as the case unfolded in London, at the very same time the Sultan was travelling from Cairo to Constantinople, where he found himself faced with a different but also oddly familiar problem. At the gates of Constantinople, in the same year, Abu Bakr would find that his sovereignty existed in a global context which had shifted around him, and for the Ottoman Empire, his carefully negotiated status as Sultan of Johore, achieved through decades of negotiation of British imperial logics, had become a liability. By 1893, the Ottoman court had become acutely sensitive to its position in the Muslim world and in the international sphere. And so in order to be received by Sultan Abdul Hamid II in Constantinople, Abu Bakr could not be recognized as Sultan of Johore, and he was instead required to present himself to the Ottoman court as a prince and noble from the Malay states. So lesson one of sovereignty in this moment, of internationalism between empires in this moment, was that becoming and remaining a sultan would require navigating between British and Ottoman recognition. And the story of Abu Bakr at the Sublime Porte provides one illustration of how regimes of legibility were made, translated, transported, retranslated, and located in circulations connecting Johore, Constantinople, London, the British Indian Empire, and the Hadramaut in Yemen. Ottoman sources make clear that Abu Bakr met with prominent pan-Islamist thinkers such as Al-Afghani, Muhammad Abdu, Egyptians such as Muhammad al-Muwaylihi, key Ottoman Islamic figures such as Muhammad Tawfiq al-Bakri, the then Ottoman High Commissioner to Egypt. And Ahmed Mukhtar Pasha. And many of these figures were either in exile or on the move themselves, adepts in mass media and communication, critically engaged in networks of Muslim mobility, modernity, reform, and translation. Seen in this light, the announcement of the adoption of the Ottoman Majalla in Johore reads as part of a strategy to build on Ottoman relations and models, but in light of a growing awareness of Islam, anti-imperialism, and law as circulating global goods. What does this approach offer to narratives of the international, imperialism, Islamic law, and the modern Muslim state? I've spoken a little bit already about the princely international, an evolving arena of the international order in which sovereignty was nested still within imperial logics and between empires in competition. The experience of figures such as Abu Bakr indicate a rich variety of spaces and systems for learning about rulership, Muslim sovereignty and statehood, networks of power, regional and global racial orders, all of which became part of repertoires they carried into institutions and arena of the international order, seeking recognition. These international legal ideas traveled and were popularized through material traveling, through mass media and scandal. The Jenny Mile episode was reported incredibly widely, as was a coverage of the Chicago World's Fair and the travels of the Sultan himself, and through performances of sex, gender, race, and wealth. Constitutions were part of this moving and material global repertoire, through which figures such as Abu Bakr, such as David Kalakaua of Hawaii, the Meiji, the Ottomans, navigated between empire and the international. And And so the book reads Islamic constitutionalism as a global genre of law in motion, reflective of these spaces and repertoires. As an early example of a modern Muslim constitution, the Constitution of Johore was experimental and many-voiced, elaborating tension between ideas of rule as dynastic, as monarchical, as Islamic, and representative. And so Johore provides a new and sweeping view of Asia from Asia, comparative political thought in practice and in motion with Asian rulers of its time. And that's lesson 2, the vantage point of Johore, which allows us a detailed view on Islamic constitutionalism as a global genre of law in motion and the translative dynamics by which law in language aided its transport, domestication, and outward institutionalization. And so here we move on to Johore, the constitution, and Islam as the religion of the state. Because it is at this point, having experienced the international and its imperial hierarchies, both in Constantinople and in London, that the Sultan of Johore adopts a constitution. It is the first in Southeast Asia, it is the third in Asia, and it is the third in the world to declare Islam as the religion of the state. It is to this document that we can trace the formulation, Islam is the religion of the state, currently in force in the Federal Constitution of Malaysia. And it is this constitution that relates the sovereignty of the Sultan to his role in safeguarding Islam. And in the scholarship, here is where the history usually splits into two, where we talk about the material repertoires on the one hand and the legal, archival, and textual on the other. Instead, I suggest that the material and semiotic repertoires we have seen as we traced Abu Bakar's itineraries also show in his legal repertoires, and that in fact the multiplicity, the ambiguity, the tension, the anxieties and contradictions of that representation and that repertoire provide a backdrop against which we might read Laud's travels alongside his from 1860 to 1896. These documents and their cognates brought the phrase Islam is the religion of the state into the constitutional lexicon in Malaya, a lexicon composed in its founding moments of multiple, contingent, ambiguous, and contradictory vocabularies. The multiplicities of translation that we see in the itineraries of Abu Bakar suggest the utility of an approach which considers the operation of multiple and entwined registers of translation, between languages, between idioms and institutions of law, between regimes and empires, and across an increasingly comparative global arena. It is in the aftermath of this lesson in 1893 in Constantinople as well as in London that the Johore Constitution comes into being in the last year of Abu Bakar's life. As part of a dynastic strategy, this was a translative document within a broader translative effort to project Johore's sovereignty and modernity beyond its borders, while re-articulating the domestic legitimacy of its rulers. As Undang-Undang Tubuh Kerajaan Negeri Johore, the text followed in a tradition of Malay legal texts. As the Johore Constitution, it inserted the state of Johore into the international system of sovereign states. And as such, the text was a legal and a political innovation, drawing on at least two traditions, the Malay Undang-Undang and the political constitution. And I'm happy to talk in more detail about the textuality of these documents and their versions in questions if you're interested. But really, just to say at this particular moment that as in portraiture, as in diplomacy, as in law and circulation, the constitution in use was itself a multi-voiced document. There are at least 3 identifiably different and contemporaneous texts, one in Jawi, Malay and Arabic script, one in Romanized Malay, and one in English. They were in circulation amongst British officials, merchant bodies, and Malay states in the years directly before and after the official promulgation. And internally, each of the texts is multiple, contradictory, ambiguous, and translational. The coexistence of all these constitutional texts archives a political order in flux in 2 registers. Firstly, they provided a multitude of terms for constitutional concepts, drawing from a range of genres, traditions, and lexicons for the articulation of sovereign power and its limits, and reflecting a diversity of normative orders for governing. But we also see within each of the texts shifting lexicons of sovereignty and polity, drawing from Malay, Islamic, Ottoman, and British notions of rulership, consent, and authority. We see in each of the texts divergences reflecting governing arrangements and dissonance on the ground. And throughout the constitutional document and its translations, we see a focus not on the religion of the state as a constituting principle in and of itself, but as an extension of the religion of the sovereign and his agents. So over and over again, we see the beginnings of a conversation about Islamic constitutionalism that is, in 1895, quite different than the Islamic constitutionalism we imagine and read today. And that is in and of itself an important moment in that history, which we've often forgotten. When the religion of the state is mentioned towards the end of the document, not its beginning, it emerges alongside guarantees of religious freedom to all subjects of the Sultan, and not as a kind of qualifying authorizing principle of the state. Right? And I'm happy, again, to talk in much more detail, if you'd like me to, in questions about the constitution itself, about its relationship to the Ottomans and the Tunisians, and about some of the kind of specific governing arrangements that it puts into place. But for now, I think it might be just important to peg that whereas 3 of the constitutional documents in Jawi, in Malay, and its Romanization refer to Islamic and Sharia elements, the version that is sent to the British merchant body in 1900 and then to the Colonial Office omits reference to Islam as an institutional order altogether, beyond as a religion of the state. So these were texts aimed at different audiences, drawing on different kinds of languages of sovereignty and projecting into different imaginations of the Johore state. By the time Johore enters the Federation of Malaya, independent of the British, the multiple texts of the Johore constitution had circulated to other Malay states and into the federal constitution. And perhaps the most enduring of those legacies was content related to Islam as the religion of the state. Categories that emerge in some of the earlier texts referring to councils of state, referring to Malay polity, survive and circulate, and resurface in the official post-independence constitution, but to very different kinds of effects. So over the course of adoption, circulation, and retranslation amongst Malay constitutions of the peninsula, there continues to be evolution of what Islam means, where it is located, and who its audiences will be. Instead, for example, of identifying broad circles of consultative actors, which then make the Sultan and the state sovereign, by the time we get to the Federation of Malaya, this constitutional text inserts into those religious qualifications conditions of race, Malayness, religion, Islam, and fidelity to the Johore Sultan. So by the moment of 1957, by the Federation of Malaysia, which is usually when the kind of timelines of Islamic constitutionalism speak of Malaysia as having a constitution that establishes Islam as the religion of the state, this text has transformed itself multiple times. Okay, to conclude. What do we get out of a history of Islam, law and sovereignty that begins from a place where global histories of law and Islam do not generally begin? I've already said, right, that told from the vantage point of the Johore Constitution, the history of modern Islamic constitutionalism emerges as a global genre of law in motion, nested alongside a history of the international and its hierarchies within imperial logics and institutions. And secondly, Johore's early embrace of the institutions and forms of the modern state made it a significant player for articulating how Asian sovereigns could navigate an international and imperial world. Its early encounters with the institutions of the international, its imperial hierarchies, its evolving jurisprudence, its cultural and its political life, provided global visibility for its logics at a time when these logics were still being articulated, explained, and elaborated. And in fact, despite the fact that we're thinking about this in terms of law being made from the margins, it is rethinking Johore a moment to remember that even within the canon of international history, Johore is far from marginal, it is foundational. It tends to be too easy to forget how central Johore has been to the history of the international and to its theoretical underpinnings, and for how long. It was the seizure of the Portuguese vessel Santa Catarina by the Dutch off the coast of Johore on February 25th, 1603, for example, that gives rise to Grotius' commentary on the law of prize and booty. And similarly, for the study of Islamic constitutionalism, Johore's adoption of the Ottoman Majalla and Islam as the religion of the state provides an early view from beyond what we have too easily tended to think of as Arabic and Persianate cores to the varied meanings and uses of Islam in the making and retention of political authority. As a history of politics and law from the global south, the legacy of early constitutional actors like Abu Bakar of Johore is a mixed one. Rather than a story either of colonial capture or resistance, the legacies of law that endure from this period of invention, translation, and recalibration have been complicated by the work of elite actors who considered modern constitutionalism as part of a dynastic strategy, not a democratic one, who utilized the language of constitutional Islam to triangulate between British, Ottoman, and local resources of authority, who capitalized upon ambiguity to tack between the local and the universal reference of law. The Islamic and the international provided resources for keeping empire at bay, but it also reinforced its racial logics and international hierarchies. Islam and its legal representations were part and parcel of Johore's modernity, as well as its newly strengthened guarantors of racial hierarchy and Malayness. And so we see that while race and religion in contemporary Malaysia have political resonance and institutional heft from multiple sources, colonial as well as post-colonial, we see in Johore's repertoires of sovereignty an already nascent vocabulary of Malayness as a qualifying condition for rule. Racial hierarchy was a material and salient part of new rising grammars of representation, national autonomy, and economic development. And as such, an analysis of the global history of Islamic constitutionalism, which considers empire, needs also to attend to race. Finally, against a view of constitutions as empowered by their monism, a single historical origin, a single voice text whose meaning provides voice to the constitutive authority of the law, the history of the Johore Constitution suggests a legal document whose condition of possibility was its multiplicity. Making the polyphony of law visible despite the claims of constitutions in the world, across the world today, right? The claims of constitutions and states that the law speaks in one voice from one authoritative origin works against the colonial story of law as much as it pushes back against narratives of law authored by the post-colonial state. This leads not only to a reading of law as multiple and circulatory, but suggests that appeals to original constitutions and single meanings should be read as political claims, as well as analytic ones. Thank you. Welcome.
We will now open the floor for questions. So, would you prefer me to take questions, or would you prefer to take?
I'm happy to take them. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, this is fascinating, and I thank you for this. I've never heard anything like this about the constitutionalism, it's a totally new look at it. And I wondered if Johore was like a Paris of culture and metropolitanism. I mean, I wish you had some pictures of it to give it more shape and body, because and also these metropolitan figures. Of course, we have come across them in English literature. The eccentric British, but of course they were inspired by the sultans, and the sultans were inspired by those British. I have still met a fellow anthropologist somewhere in England who had a picture of someone in total tribal gear, which is not much clothing but a lot of things on him, and that was his best friend that he went to see from time to time. So for me, you really hit here at something that I find extremely interesting, also for the wideness and openness of Islam at that time to be, and I think that the reaction in cosmopolitan cities of the world like Paris or London, or even where there are kingdoms, it was a fascination with this other way of being and an openness towards it that I wish we could, sort of get it back, to have more fun and to live together with more understanding and appreciation of the differences. I mean, this myth that he was also Albert Baker, and I was just blowing it. I mean, thank you, but can you tell me more about Johore?
Yes. So that's interesting. The Paris analogy is interesting because Paris is a sort of territorial, landlocked, riverine cosmopolis, right?
Yes.
Johore's cosmopolitanism derived at the time in the 1600s at the moment of Grotius, in the 1800s at the moment of Stamford Raffles, in the current moments, right? With Singapore being one of the busiest ports in the world. That cosmopolitanism is an archipelagic, diasporic, and maritime one, right? So it's a cosmopolitanism made up of networks of moving people and families and capital and culture. And so because of that, I think while you would look at Johore and see on its coast some things that are recognizable, right? Buildings in the European style that were built by Abu Bakar immediately after his rise, right? What you don't see is a kind of territorial mass of concentrated cultural capital undergirded by actual capital, right? That would be a little bit more Singapore. Your question was really generative for me because as you're talking about it, it makes me think as well about what cosmopolitanism looked like at the moment and what it required. And as far as I can tell, the World's Fair is a very nice example of this kind of experimentation of what cosmopolitanism should be. And in 1893, you've got in Chicago the World's Columbian Exposition, right, which was the White City. Right? Enormous pavilions built in the Greco-Roman style, all white, to which the only Asian representation was Japan, and that was achieved through massive amounts of, capital and corruption, right? Outside of the gates of the White City was the Midway, which still is the Midway outside of the University of Chicago, right? And the Midway was the kind of discount carnival part of the World's Fair. You could pay a small amount of money and you could go and you could have snacks and you could watch dancing girls and you could buy a hat, right? But the geographic organization of the Midway was in racial and hierarchical proximity and distance from the White City. So the Turks and the Japanese and the French, right, had pavilions very close to the White City, and then the further and further away you got, at the very end, you've got sort of the Dahomey, the Kingdom of Benin, right, and Native Americans. So cosmopolitanism was many things, right? It was absolutely experimentation and friendship and intimacy. It was also consumption and capital and tourism.
Yeah.
And it was also immensely racially organized, right? And I think all of these things continue to be true about Paris and Johore and London and Geneva and Washington, D.C., right? And I think the fact that telling this story generates moments of recognition of how things are and could be and once were, right, is an indication perhaps that not very much has changed. But to answer the specific question you asked, the only part of Johore that was developed in the way that one would recognize, from the sort of language of your question, was the sort of port immediately facing Singapore. The development that mattered at the time was railways, plantations, and river travel and control of the ports. So it was a different kind of cultural capital, I think. I thank you very much.
Yes, circles, yes. Cultural circles. Like I was in Somalia and I met Musa Galal, who was a poet, and he was living. But he so appreciated his visit to the West, not because of the riches, but the way you could be freely together with other poets. He also understood cosmopolitanism, though he was living in a kind of, a shoal, right. Really, a hovel.
Right.
Yeah. So I was wondering if you had that kind of cultural life.
Yes, what is documented is the cultural life that came through because of the Yemeni and the Hadrami diaspora, right? So of the Red Sea, the cultural life that came through from increasing amounts of sort of Chinese labor and capital, less so the cultural life that we would recognize it through sort of exposure to the West. I mean, the Meiji, for example, right, built the Rokomekan in the 1880s, which is a kind of fenced-off city like Paris in Tokyo, and it is the only place where Japanese and Westerners can mix. And this was the 1881 to onwards, right? And one of the things that the Chancellor finds is that when people come to the Rokomekan, they complain that the Japanese women are wearing Western outfits, and they had come to Japan so that they could see Japanese women wearing, the other kinds of outfits, like traditional outfits. And the Chancellor of Japan says, how will they take us seriously if we look like paper dolls? So I think even the content of that kind of cross-civilizational encounter was, at this moment, very carefully staged. Thank you.
So you stressed the concept, the phrasing itself of Islam as the religion of the state and its relevance in today's Malaysia. So I wonder if you could trace a bit on how this concept itself, how it reaches the Constitution of Johore and how it persists throughout the centuries.
Yeah, it's a good point. So the first place that Islam shows up in the 1895 Constitution is as an attribute of the sovereign, right? So at the very beginning of the Constitution, Islam is not the religion of the state. It is membership in the religion of Islam, being Muslim, is one of the things that authorizes the sovereign, right? You get to the miscellaneous, this is like Article 57 or something, right? The entire document is a dynastic document. We get to the very end, and this phrase, which is what is called the religion of the state for the territory and the state of Johore, is the Muslim religion. And as such being the case, the Muslim religion shall continue and forever be and be acknowledged to be and spoken of as the state religion. And then there is another phrase which continues to survive as well in the federal constitution of today, although all other religions are allowed and are always understood as proper to be allowed to be practiced in peace and harmony by the people professing them in all and every part, so on and so forth. So some of that language is Ottoman. Some of it is it's not obvious where it comes from, but the way in which it is phrased makes me suspect that this is British lawyers articulating Victorian ideas about Christianity and its role in Victoria's United Kingdom, and translating them in this way, right? So the Constitution of Tunisia, which is the first Muslim world constitution, right? It does not establish Islam as the religion of the state. So in 1861, the only mention in Tunisia in the constitution of Islam is to a phrase that is actually in this constitution, which is Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqd, which is the people who loose and bind. So it's a polity discussion, right? So the constitution of Tunisia does not establish Islam as the religion of the state, but it makes possible the authorizing of the state through a particular circle of people who are recognized because of the Sharia. The constitution of the Ottoman Empire does have some of this phrasing, and by the time you get to Johore, these have been kind of retranslated and refiltered to come up with this particular kind of formulation. Over the course of the next 50 years, this kind of formulation makes its way across constitutions up and down the Malay Peninsula, so Terengganu, Kelantan, Perak, all of which are existing states in the Malayan Federation. And when the sultans are negotiating independence from the British, the Constitutional Commission that is given the task of coming up with a formal draft constitution, the British gather together, I think 9 legal experts and lawyers from across the Commonwealth, including judges and lawyers from Ireland, India and Pakistan. And Kristen Stilt has written about this in a journal article, and she makes clear that in the 1930s and the 1940s, it becomes clear that the British and the Sultans are in agreement that the religion of the Federation should not be Islam. Because if the religion of the Federation is Islam, then the central government in Kuala Lumpur controls it, right? So the Sultans, having placed religion in each of their constitutions, then refuse to allow it to percolate upwards into the sovereignty of the Federation because they wish to continue to exercise authoritative control over it. And that is a clear understanding from the 30s into the 40s. The judge from Pakistan in the middle of the Constitutional Convention Commission begins to make an argument that the religion of the Federation should also be Islam. But he makes that argument based not on the Johore Constitution or any other constitution that comes before it, but on the experience of Pakistan. And he says, there's no problem, right? Why would there be a problem calling Islam the religion of the state? We've done it and it's caused no issues whatsoever, right? So despite this long indigenous tradition that comes from an earlier global history, the history of the Federation of Malaysia Constitution, establishment of Islam as the religion of the state, is not Johore, it is Pakistan. Yeah,
thanks for your really fascinating talk. I think it's really so informative, first of all, to understand how a constitution also could have been otherwise by conducting a genealogy of the emergence of the text, and I think you show that so well, so thanks a lot. My question would have been so the text in the end had to settle around a version. I mean, of course, there was polyphony to that, and of course, different versions had been discussed, but then in the end, as you show here very well, some texts were deleted and so on. So a version kind of made it, so to say, as the final one. And I was wondering whether you could speak a little bit about maybe the hierarchies and power dynamics at the time, which may kind of shed light on those conditions of possibility which you talked about, and like, so how come that certain parts were deleted and others not, for example, and like thinking about power dynamics at the time when this was all negotiated.
Yeah, thank you very much. So this last image is stamps issued to commemorate by the Malaysian Post Office, right? To commemorate the 125th anniversary of the Johore Constitution, and you'll see Abu Bakar, who you by now have been conditioned to totally recognize, right? And then his descendants going to on your right. The man who is currently Sultan of Johore, but also ruler of the Federation. And underneath them, exactly the process of solidification of texts that you point to. I think one of the things that social-legal scholars, anthropologists of law, law and society scholars, law and humanities scholars have been trying to get us to think more carefully about is, in fact, believing a little bit less the lies that the law tells about itself, right? That the archive by which multiple texts become one is fugitive, it is very difficult to pin down, and you can see, in fact, an increasing reluctance by the state, by its lawyers, by its courts to acknowledge that such a thing ever existed, right? Which multiplicity, polyphony. The same is true about international law, right? That it's a real surprise that in the 1890s, the judges on the British bench don't know what a sovereign is, have to ask the Colonial Office, right? That's not a part of the history of international law that I was taught, right? And we tend to think about the story of international law as having been sort of sealed and solidified before then. So I think the first thing is that, as frustrating as it is, I kind of think that it's analytically important for us to hold on to the fact that these are not unitary texts, right, into the present moment. And that's not just a question about interpretation and jurisprudence. It is also about the fact that, people will not only argue about what the texts say, but they will speak about these texts differently to different audiences at different moments for different purposes, right? So I think that's the first thing. But of course you're right, that there are clearly three versions in that postage stamp, right? What remains and what gets winnowed out and what has to fight for its survival, whereas, something else is totally comfortable in there. One of the interesting things about that is that the last of the 1895 texts, right, the English typescript version, which is sent from Johore to the Colonial Office and to the British Council of Commerce, the Merchant Council in Singapore, the English text. That English version is the one that is most noticeably present through every English version that then emerges of the Johore Constitution. So there's a way in which it isn't just colonial interpretations, it's also capital and economic interests that are already thinking about the law in a way that is different than Malay traditions of law, which insist on its reification and its formalization and its monism, right? So there is enshrined in the versions that follow is not only that English text and its meanings, but also its philosophy of law and legislative monism, and an infrastructure of training, of legal education, of the teaching of judges, of the qualification of lawyers, of the building of law schools, of the training of public officials, all of which culturally and institutionally back that 1900 colonial office document. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, may I ask you, in what script was it originally drafted? Was that Arabic, or was it one of the Asian languages? It was quite a shock for me when I came to Asia for the first time to see that I was not literate at all when I looked around me.
Yes. So the version that gets called the official Constitution of 1895 is printed by government printers in Jawi, which is Malay and Arabic script.
Malay and Arabic. And the Malay script is like many of the Asian scripts that I've seen, that they're own.
By this moment in the southern Malay Peninsula, in Singapore and in the Riau Archipelago, Malay is being written in the vernacular largely in Arabic script, and then it is Romanized, but quite late.
Yeah, it brings me to one more question, then I want to speak anymore. But you mentioned, in fact, so Johore, that's in Asia, and it's not Arabic. And when I was in Iran and, in that part of the world, the Muslims very much resented that they were now supposed to Arabize. And they said, yes, but we do not want to give up our own heritage. Why should we? So I wonder, how did they manage to do that when there was such a powerful start of international presence of the Muslim world through this Johore constitutionalism?
Yeah. One of the unexpected outcomes of following this guy around for 10 years in the archive, right, was in fact a realization about really the extremely divergent and diverse places from which they drew authority for governing, right? So the majalla that comes from the Ottoman Empire to Johore is in Arabic, right? Even though because it is Arabic is the language of Ottoman jurisprudence. But the Islamic elites who are in place in the Sultan's court as his advisors, as members of his family, right, as economic partners, are largely not Ottoman. They are Hadrami. They are members of the Red Sea, Gujarati, and Yemeni diaspora. So Arabic speaking, but not Arab in the way that we would now understand it, right? Part of a kind of circulating Arabophone, Gujarati, Malay-speaking Indian Ocean diaspora, for which Islam means many things, right? Very little of it concentrated in the Hijaz, very little of it, in fact, concentrated in Constantinople. So there are many centers of the Muslim world at this moment. Aceh is one of them, Johore and Singapore are another, Cairo is another, Constantinople, and the Hadramaut. But as you say, right, there's no obvious North Pole in this particular universe. I think the other is that for Johore, there was no contradiction between symbolic modernization and symbolic anti-British imperialism and symbolic Islamization, that the Ottomans provided all of those possibilities, as did, to a certain extent, the Meiji and the Hawaiians and the Siamese and others, right? So I think one of the other things that has shifted in our moment is that it is easy to forget that there was a moment when we didn't automatically assume that those things were in conflict, in tension.
Exactly. Thank you.
Yes.
Ezgi Kahraman. I'm a professor of urban planning and urban sociology from Turkey.
Thank you.
And I'm serving as a senior fellow here. at the Center of Global Migration at this institute. And it's very important, interesting for me to read the 4 different images of Johore.
Yeah.
If you can see it, I may
Is it
interpret it
Yeah.
through the perspective of the changing characteristics of Ottoman leaders.
Yes.
Okay, because I find it very interesting, and I find very similarities between his changing outfits and the characteristics of Ottoman leaders. The first image represents for me, from the Ottoman perspective, is the beginning of the Ottoman Empire. At the beginning, the leaders, Ottoman leaders, were not called sultans, but bey.
Yeah.
Bey means, I know that you know, bey means chieftain, like this in English. And I can see the proud, the naiveness, and also the strongness and ambition of the Ottoman leaders in the first one. In the second one, the confidence. The third one is out of the context because of the Scottish version. But the last one is completely represents the sultans of Ottoman.
Yes.
Very proud, a little bit arrogant, and also, for me, luxurious.
Yes.
And which also leads to the collapse of Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
I want you to know the ideas about this connection between the personality of and the connection of Johore and the Ottoman leaders.
Yeah.
If you can.
I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And it's lovely to hear it because I'm not an Ottoman historian, right? And so I can only hope that I'm right. That's great. Yes, there is in fact a posed portrait, a very famous posed portrait of Sultan Abdulhamid II, where they look extremely similar, right? It's extremely similar. The thing that's also interesting about that is that there is a portrait like this of Chulalongkorn of Siam, right? There is a portrait like this of David Kalakaua, the last king of Hawaii, same period. There is a portrait like this of the Meiji princes and empire. There is a portrait like this of the Princes Albert and George, whatever his other, George something, right? The children of Victoria. There is a portrait like this of Albert himself, right? Her husband. There is a very, I think that when I started all of this, and I think it continues to be the case, for political scientists to talk about clothes is so not okay, right? But I think pedagogically, right, it makes so clear to students what we're talking about and I think our analytic challenge is not so much look at this and notice how similar it is. It is to say, why would we think that these representations that were obviously authored, authoritative, multilingual, and outwardly projecting wouldn't also be true about law and economy and administration and education, right? Why would we assume that these representations couldn't also tell us something about power and about law and about the text of constitutional work when they occur at exactly the same moment and for exactly the same reason that the laws are being written. Right. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah.
The law is an attribute of their power, of the way they exert it, so for sure there must be a connection.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much. I really appreciated this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. I think we all learned very much, and it was also a great dialogue with the audience. So thank you very much, and yes, please join me in congratulating our